Long before America learned to write itself into history, the land was already telling stories. They were not written in ink or stone. They were whispered into rivers, folded into forests, buried beneath hills where no roads ever stayed straight for long. The stories did not ask to be remembered. They only asked to be listened to. Most people never heard them. But once in a generation, someone did. The girl disappeared on the 4th morning of spring. Her name was Lillian Crow, and she vanished in a town so small it barely existed on maps, Hollow Creek, West Virginia. The creek that gave the town its name ran thin and clear, cutting through moss-covered rock and old iron roots. Children played there. Old men fished there. No one ever thought the water could take something back. But on that morning, the creek sang. Not loudly, not enough for adults to hear. Only enough for children, animals, and those who still believed the land might answer if spoken to kindly. Lillian followed the sound. She left behind one shoe on the bank, her footprints ending where the water should have been too shallow to hide anything at all. They never found her body. The town searched for 7 days. They drained the creek. They combed the woods. They called in state police, volunteers, dogs that tracked every scent but hers. It was as if Lillian had stepped sideways instead of forward. By the 8th day, the town stopped looking. Not because they had given up, but because something else began to happen. Children started telling stories. They said Lillian still walked the creek at dusk. They said she stood barefoot on the stones, hair dry, dress clean, smiling like she knew a joke no one else did. They said when she spoke, the water bent toward her voice. Parents scolded their children for lying. Pastors preached about grief and imagination. But the stories didn't stop. They never do. 30 years later, Elias Ward came to Hollow Creek with a notebook full of empty pages and a job he didn't believe in anymore. He was a folklorist by profession, which meant he collected stories people pretended weren't true and filed them away where no one important ever read them. He had chased rumors across Appalachia, through New England mill towns, down into the Louisiana bayous. Everywhere he went, the stories changed, but the structure stayed the same. A child disappears, the land answers, and someone pays the price for listening. Elias had started to wonder if America had fairy tales of its own, or if it had simply forgotten how to admit they were real. Hollow Creek was his last stop before quitting. The first night, he stayed in a rented room above the old general store. The floorboards creaked like they remembered heavier footsteps. Outside, the creek murmured constantly, even when no wind stirred the trees. Elias couldn't sleep. At exactly 11:11 p.m., he heard a knock at his door. 3 taps. Slow. Deliberate. When he opened it, no one stood there, only a wet footprint. Bare, child-sized, leading down the stairs. He followed it. The store below was dark, shelves stripped long ago, dust thick enough to record history in every step. The footprint continued through the back door and out toward the creek. Elias hesitated. Then, against his better judgment, he followed. The moon hung low, swollen and yellow, casting the creek in pale silver. The water flowed too smoothly, like glass sliding downhill. The footprint stopped at the edge. That was when the singing began. Soft, wordless, beautiful in the way sadness sometimes is. And standing in the creek, exactly where Lillian Crow had vanished 3 decades earlier, was a girl who had never aged a day. She looked up when Elias approached. Her eyes were the wrong color for the dark, too bright, reflecting starlight that wasn't there. "You're late," she said. Elias swallowed. "I'm sorry," he replied, though he didn't know why. She smiled. "That's all right," she said. "The state always waits." Behind her, the creek shifted, not flowed, shifted. as if something beneath it turned over in its sleep. Elias felt the ground respond beneath his feet, a subtle pressure, like a held breath. "What are you?" he asked. The girl tilted her head. "I'm what happens," she said, "when a story is told long enough that it forgets who started it." The water rose around her ankles without wetting her dress. "You should go," she added gently. "Adults don't stay long once they see us." "Us?" Elias asked. The forest answered first. Lights appeared between the trees, dozens of them, flickering like fireflies, but steadier, older. Shapes stepped forward, figures half remembered from children's books and campfire warnings. Tall men with bark for skin, women whose hair flowed like river weeds, small, sharp-eyed things that watched from shadows and smiled without warmth. American fairy tales, unwritten, unfinished, waiting. "The land made us," the girl said, "before the names, before the borders." Elias's hands trembled. "You took her," he said. "Lillian." The girl shook her head. "No," she replied. She chose to listen. The creek hummed louder. Someone always does. From deep beneath the water, a sound echoed, like a bell wrapped in moss and memory. The girl stepped closer to the bank. "You came to write us down," she said. "But stories don't like cages." "What do you want?" Elias asked. Her smile faded. "We want to be remembered," she said softly. "And we want something in return." The creek surged. The lights in the forest leaned forward, and Hollow Creek, long asleep, began to wake. Elias did not remember stepping away from the creek. Later, he would recall the sensation the way one remembers a dream. Fragmented, heavy with meaning, but lacking sequence. One moment he stood on the bank, staring into a chorus of lights and half-formed shapes. The next, he was sitting on the floor of his rented room, notebook open in his lap, dawn light spilling across the pages. The creek still sang, softly, as if pleased. Hollow Creek changed after that night, not in ways most people would notice. The town did not grow. No businesses returned. No headlines followed. But the edges softened. Doors creaked open that had been sealed for decades. Gardens bloomed where soil had long been thin. Animals returned. Foxes, owls, deer that watched from the tree line without fear. And children began talking again. Elias spent his days walking the town, listening. At the elementary school playground, a boy with scraped knees told him about the woman who braided rivers together when they crossed. A girl insisted the woods behind her house belonged to a tall man, made of leaves, who demanded politeness and offerings of bread. Another child spoke of a woman who lived inside the creek itself, who sang names instead of songs, always names, always chosen. Elias wrote everything down, and with every word, the air felt thicker, like a promise being slowly remembered. The girl from the creek came to him the third night. She did not knock this time. She sat in the chair across from his bed, feet dangling inches above the floor. "You're being careful," she said. "That's good." Elias rubbed his eyes. "You're real," he said weakly. She smiled. "So are you, for now." "What happens when I finish writing?" he asked. She studied him. "America forgets quickly," she said. "It was built that way, always moving forward, always naming things to pretend they're owned." She leaned closer. "But the land remembers." The walls creaked as if agreeing. She told him about the whispering state, not a place, not exactly, a condition, a threshold between belief and abandonment. "When enough people stop believing in a story," she said, "it doesn't die. It changes states. Like water to ice, like breath to fog, like children to ghosts. The fairy tales of America had not vanished. They had slipped sideways, woven themselves into forests, rivers, hills, and forgotten towns. They learned to survive without names, feeding on moments when humans still listened. "Children hear us first," she said, "but adults decide whether we stay." Elias swallowed. "And Lillian?" The girl's eyes dimmed. "She stayed," she said, "because she was brave enough to listen." The bargain was older than the country. When settlers arrived, the land offered stories in exchange for respect. Some listened, many didn't. Those who did were allowed to stay, to prosper quietly. Those who didn't found their towns failing, their crops dying, their rivers turning against them. Then the stories were called superstition. Then lies. Then nothing at all. "That's when we started taking," the girl said simply. Elias realized then that Hollow Creek had not been spared. It had been spared so far. "You're waking things up," he said. "Yes," she replied, "because someone finally remembered to ask us what we want." The creek outside rose slightly, lapping at its banks. "And what do you want?" Elias asked. She placed her hand over his notebook. "To be written," she said, "properly, as we are. Not softened, not turned into children's lessons." She met his eyes. "And we want a voice." The first outsider arrived 2 days later, a woman in a gray government sedan with no markings and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Mara Hensley, Department of Cultural Preservation. She asked about the stories. Elias said nothing. That night, the lights in the forest burned brighter. By the end of the week, more arrived: researchers, surveyors, people who pretended to study folklore while measuring land and water levels. The creek grew restless. Animals fled. Children stopped sleeping. "They're trying to catalog us," the girl said. "That's another kind of cage." "What happens if they succeed?" Elias asked. Her answer came from the woods, a deep, ancient voice, slow and patient. "We leave," it said. The ground trembled beneath the town. "And when we go," the voice continued, "the land remembers who refused to listen." Elias stood on the creek bank at dusk, notebook heavy with truth. He understood now. America had fairy tales. They were just inconvenient, unprofitable, dangerous. The stories didn't want to be saved. They wanted to be heard, and hearing them meant choosing sides. That night, Elias began to read aloud, not to people, to the land. He read names long forgotten. He spoke of rivers that walked, hills that breathed, towns that vanished because they stopped listening. He spoke of Lillian Crow, who had stepped sideways and never returned. The creek rose. The forest leaned in. The whispering state opened its eyes. From the hills came movement, not fleeing, not attacking, arriving. Fair folk stepped into the open, not gentle, not cruel, but ancient and undeniable. They stood in streets, on rooftops, in doorways that had not been opened in years. The town of Hollow Creek became a threshold, and America, once again, had to decide whether it was willing to listen. The government did not arrive loudly. There were no sirens, no roadblocks, no declarations. Hollow Creek simply found itself surrounded by people who pretended to be ordinary, campers who didn't camp, engineers who never fixed anything, officials who smiled too often and wrote too much down. The whispering state noticed immediately. The creek darkened. The lights in the forest withdrew just far enough to be dangerous. Elias woke one morning to find the town quiet, in a way it had never been before. No birds, no insects. Even the creek had fallen silent. He stepped outside and saw that every child in Hollow Creek stood barefoot in the street, staring toward the tree line. Their faces were calm, expectant. The girl from the creek stood among them. "It's time," she said. "For what?" Elias asked. "To choose who tells the story," she replied. Mara Hensley returned that afternoon with others like her. They gathered the townspeople in front of the old general store. Cameras appeared. Equipment hummed softly. Someone erected a temporary stage. "We are here to preserve," Mara announced, "to protect cultural anomalies and prevent mass hysteria." The fairy lights flickered faintly at the edge of the woods. Elias stepped forward. "You can't preserve this," he said. "You don't even have the language for it." Mara smiled thinly. "Everything can be documented." Behind her, the ground shifted. Something beneath Hollow Creek stretched. That night, the first bargain was broken. A man named Harold Pike, born in Hollow Creek, left at 18, returned only because nowhere else would keep him, walked into the woods drunk and angry. He shouted insults into the dark, mocking the stories, daring the land to prove itself. The woods answered. They found him at dawn, not dead. Changed. His mouth was gone, replaced by smooth skin. His eyes reflected too much light. His shadow moved half a second slower than he did. The children screamed. The adults understood. The girl stood beside Elias as the town gathered again. "This is what happens when respect ends," she said quietly. Mara watched from a distance, expression unreadable. "That was a warning," Elias said. "Yes," the girl replied. "And the last one." The fairy court assembled at the creek that night. They were no longer hiding their shapes. Tall figures woven from bark and bone. Pale women with eyes like river stones. Small, sharp things that whispered names no one remembered belonging to them. At their center stood the girl, Lillian Crow, though she no longer used the name. She raised her hand, and the land listened. "We offered stories," she said. "You offered forgetting." The creek surged. "We offered coexistence," she continued. "You offered cages." The ground trembled as if the earth itself shifted uncomfortably. "One voice must speak for us," she said, "and one must pay." Elias felt it then, the pull, not fear, recognition. "You want me," he said. Lillian looked at him with something like sadness. "You came to listen," she said. "That makes you dangerous." Mara stepped forward suddenly. "No," she said sharply. "We won't allow—" The woods swallowed her words. The sound died before it reached the creek. The bargain was simple. Elias would become the story keeper. Not a man. Not entirely human. A bridge. He would remember what America refused to. He would speak when the land demanded it. He would never belong fully to the world he came from again. In return, the fairy tales would remain. Hidden. Watching. Waiting. Elias knelt at the creek. The water rose, cool and heavy, climbing his legs, his chest, his throat. It did not drown him. It rewrote him. He felt names settle into his bones, rivers he had never seen, hills that breathed, towns that vanished because they forgot how to listen. His heart slowed, then steadied. When he stood again, the world felt louder. Every footstep echoed with memory. Every breath carried stories not yet told. Lillian smiled. "Welcome," she said, "to the Whispering State." The government left Hollow Creek within days. No reports were filed. No footage remained. The town was marked unsafe and quietly erased from future maps. But the land stayed awake. Children across America began telling new old stories. Of roads that moved, of forests that watched, of rivers that remembered names long after people forgot them. Parents dismissed them. Adults always do. But the stories spread anyway. They always do. Elias walked the country for years, sometimes seen, mostly not. When a town forgot too much, he arrived. When a river grew angry, he listened. When a child stood at the edge of a creek and heard singing, he stood nearby, just in case. America never noticed him. But the land did. And somewhere beneath it all, the Whispering State waited, not for belief, but for respect. Elias learned the cost slowly. The Whispering State did not rush punishment. It believed in patience, in erosion rather than collapse. The land had waited centuries. It could wait a little longer for one man to understand what he had become. At first, the changes were subtle. He stopped aging. Not dramatically. No sudden freezing in time. But the years passed without leaving marks. His hair never grayed. His hands never stiffened. He felt hunger less often, sleep less deeply. Pain became distant, like weather heard through walls. People noticed. They always did. In a town in northern Maine, a woman stared at him too long and whispered, "You haven't changed." He left before dawn. In Arizona, a man took his photograph and frowned when the image blurred, Elias's outline dissolving into dust and tree shadow. He stopped letting people look at him closely. The land, however, never looked away. It spoke constantly now, not in words, but in sensation. Pressure behind the eyes when a forest was cut too fast, a metallic taste on the tongue when a river was poisoned, a sudden ache in the chest when a town ignored its dead. Elias learned to read these signs like weather. When the ache grew unbearable, he knew it was time to intervene. The first true confrontation came in California. A development company planned to drain a marsh that had never fully appeared on maps. The locals called it useless land, mosquito country, waste. The marsh had another name. It whispered it to Elias as he stood at its edge. Not yet. The machines arrived at dawn. The land answered by noon. Fog rolled in thick and wrong, swallowing sound. The ground softened beneath the machinery, pulling it down inch by inch. Workers fled screaming as shapes moved beneath the water. Slow, patient, uninterested in pursuit. No one died. But the marsh remained. The company quietly abandoned the project. The papers blamed unstable soil. Elias moved on. Word began to circulate in places where power hid itself. Not of Elias specifically, but of patterns. Projects failed where they should have succeeded. Surveys went wrong. Instruments malfunctioned. Entire towns resisted change without knowing why. Someone started connecting the dots. They found him in Montana. A quiet woman with iron-gray hair and a voice trained never to shake. She called herself Director Halverson and did not pretend to be anything else. "You're not Folklore," she said, as they sat across from one another in an empty diner. "You're infrastructure." Elias stirred his coffee, though he never drank it. "I don't belong to you," he replied. Halverson nodded. "That's the problem." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, blurred, distorted, but unmistakable. Elias at different points across decades, always the same age, always present where things went wrong. "We can't control the land," Halverson said, "but we can control the stories." Elias closed the folder. "Stories don't like cages," he said. She smiled thinly. "Neither do nations." That night, the Whispering State stirred violently. Forests groaned. Rivers surged. The land sensed intention. "They want to erase you," Lillian's voice whispered from the dark. She appeared beside him, unchanged, eternal in a way Elias now understood too well. "They already tried," Elias said. "Yes," she replied, "and they will try again." The fairy courts gathered in places unseen. Old powers shifted, uneasy. "The land is tired," Lillian said. "It has been patient long enough." America pushed back. Not openly. Not yet. Stories were dismissed more aggressively. Children's books rewritten. Folklore programs defunded. Oral histories quietly archived and buried. The Whispering State weakened. Not disappearing, but thinning, and when the stories thinned, the land began to hurt. Elias stood at the edge of the Mississippi River one night, feeling its exhaustion like a bruise inside his chest. "We can't keep doing this," he said to the water. The river answered with silence. For the first time since Hollow Creek, Elias felt doubt. Immortality was not power. It was endurance, and endurance had limits. The fairy courts convened one final time, not in a forest, not by a creek, but beneath the land itself, where roots met stone and memory pooled thick and dark. Lillian stood at the center. "The bargain must change," she said, "or it will break." Elias understood. He always had. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "To stop walking alone," she replied. The land did not want a story keeper anymore. It wanted witnesses, plural, messy, human, mortal. Elias felt fear for the first time in years, and relief. The whispering state prepared to do what it had never done before. It prepared to speak, not in whispers, but in storms. The storms did not arrive all at once. That would have been mercy. Instead, they came like sentences spoken slowly, deliberately, so no one could pretend they hadn't heard. The first broke over the Pacific Northwest, a storm system that refused to move. Rain fell straight down, not wind-driven, not chaotic, but patient. Rivers rose without flooding. Trees drank deeply. Landslides threatened, but never came. Meteorologists called it a stall. The land called it a reminder. Elias felt it from hundreds of miles away. The ache behind his eyes sharpened into clarity. For the first time since Hollow Creek, the whispering state was not whispering. It was clearing its throat. "You're going to scare them," Elias said quietly, standing on a ridge above a valley in Oregon, where fog pooled unnaturally. "That is not our intention," came a voice from the trees. Old, layered, not one speaker, but many. But fear listens when respect does not. Lillian stepped out of the mist beside him. "They have forgotten how to be small," she said. Across the country, the signs multiplied. In the Midwest, fields bloomed overnight with plants no botanist could name, flowers described only in half-remembered settler journals, and native songs older than the nation itself. In New Mexico, a desert wind uncovered stone circles that maps insisted were not there. People who entered them felt watched, not threatened, but measured. In Louisiana, bayous spoke names into the dark. Fishermen heard their grandfathers answering back. America did not panic. America debated. Talk shows argued whether the phenomena were natural cycles or mass hysteria. Politicians urged calm and investment in rational explanations. Think tanks formed overnight, tasked with neutralizing narrative threats. Director Halverson stood at a podium in Washington and used a word she knew would catch: containment. The whispering state recoiled. Elias began to move faster. He could feel the strain now, the land pushing against a nation that refused to bend. Something would break. Either the stories would vanish completely, or they would stop asking permission. He went to places that hurt the most. Coal towns hollowed out and forgotten. Floodplains built over and drowned again and again. Reservations where the land still remembered treaties better than the government did. Everywhere, people listened when he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because the ground seemed to lean closer when he did. He never stayed long. Witnesses were being planted. Lillian grew quieter. "You're fading," Elias told her one night, as they walked along a river that glowed faintly under moonlight. "Yes," she said. "That is the cost of being remembered by many instead of one." Elias stopped walking. "This ends with me, doesn't it?" She met his gaze. "It ends with choice," she said. "It always does." The breaking point came in the heart of the country. A proposed megastructure, data storage, energy routing, control disguised as progress, planned directly atop an ancient convergence. The land screamed when the first drill touched soil. The whispering state surged. Storms converged from all directions. Rivers swelled. Winds carried voices no one could identify. Children began speaking languages they had never learned. America noticed then. Elias stood at the site as machines idled, workers frozen by an instinct they couldn't name. Halverson arrived by helicopter. "You can stop this," she said over the roar of the wind. "Tell it to stand down." Elias looked at the land beneath his feet. For the first time, it did not answer him immediately, because it wasn't asking anymore. The fairy courts appeared openly. Not monsters, not angels. Truth. Tall, small, beautiful, terrible, layered with the memory of a continent that had never been empty. Lillian stepped forward. "We kept quiet," she said. "We waited. We bargained. We endured." The wind howled. No more. Elias felt the final choice settle into his bones. He could anchor the whispering state again, become its last prison, hold it quiet so the world could go on pretending. Or he could let it dissolve, release the stories into people instead of places, end the need for a keeper, end himself. He thought of Hollow Creek, of Lillian standing barefoot in the water, of America, always moving forward, never looking down. He smiled sadly. "I choose witnesses," he said. The whispering state unraveled, not violently, gracefully. Stories lifted from the land and flowed into people. Dreams, instincts, sudden reverence. Children told them first, then adults, reluctantly, then scholars, carefully. Fairy tales did not return as belief. They returned as respect. The storms weakened. The land exhaled. Elias felt himself thinning, not dying, spreading. His last sight was Lillian smiling, not sadly, but proudly, as she dissolved into river light. "You did well," she whispered. Years later, America told different stories, not kinder, not simpler, but truer. When rivers flooded, people listened. When forests burned, they remembered names. When towns failed, they asked what had been ignored. No one remembered Elias Ward. But sometimes, when the land shifted just right, people felt watched, not judged, but accompanied. And somewhere beneath it all, the whispering state rested. No longer hidden, no longer alone. Time did not heal what happened. It adjusted. That was the difference the land insisted on. Healing implied erasure. Adjustment meant memory carried forward, reshaped, but intact. The whispering state had dissolved, but its echo remained threaded through the country like a second nervous system. Quiet, reactive, impossible to fully silence again. America woke differently after that. Not all at once, not consciously, but in the way people began to hesitate before cutting, before building, before naming things as if names alone were ownership. The fairy tales did not return wearing crowns or wings. They returned as instincts. A woman in Oregon felt compelled to leave offerings of bread at the edge of her field without knowing why. A child in Georgia refused to cross a creek at dusk because it was listening. An old man in Michigan spoke aloud to a forest before hunting, just in case someone was home. No one called it belief. They called it habit. The government tried, briefly, to reverse it. New classifications appeared. Language softened. Terms like ecological anomaly and cognitive inheritance replaced words like fairy and folklore. Grants were issued. Panels convened. 1,000 papers attempted to explain away what people already felt in their bones. Director Halverson retired quietly. Her final report was sealed, but one sentence leaked. "You cannot regulate a relationship." The land tested its boundaries carefully. Floods came, but followed old paths instead of carving new wounds. Fires burned, but stopped where respect was shown. Storms spoke loudly but briefly. no longer needing to shout to be heard. Disaster did not vanish. It learned to negotiate. Children became the clearest sign that something had changed. They drew maps that didn't match roads. They named places adults couldn't see. They invented games with rules no one taught them, rules that mirrored old pacts. Don't take more than you offer. Don't follow music you didn't ask for. Don't promise what you can't keep. Parents laughed. Teachers paused. Some remembered stories their grandparents used to tell and wondered why they had stopped. Lillian Crow was remembered differently now. In Hollow Creek, which returned to maps quietly, without explanation, she was no longer called missing. A plaque appeared near the water, placed by no official order, engraved with simple words. She listened. Flowers grew there year-round. Elias existed everywhere and nowhere. Sometimes, hikers felt a presence guiding them away from unstable ground. Sometimes, a writer woke with a sentence already formed, insisting on being written exactly as it was. Sometimes, someone standing at the edge of a choice felt an inexplicable pressure, not force, not fear, just a reminder that something older was paying attention. That was Elias. Not a man, a memory with intent. The fairy courts did not vanish. They changed shape. Some settled into mountains, others into rivers. Some dissolved entirely, content to be felt rather than seen. They didn't rule. They observed. They intervened rarely now. Witnesses had been planted. That was enough. Decades passed. America told a new fairy tale, not to children, but to itself. It was not about magic saving the day. It was about listening before asking, about remembering that land is not silent just because it does not speak in words, about understanding that stories are not decorations, they are agreements. On a quiet evening in late spring, a girl stood barefoot at the edge of a creek somewhere in West Virginia. The water sang softly. She smiled, not because she was being called away, but because she felt recognized. She went home before dark. That mattered. The whispering state no longer whispered. It breathed. And America, finally, learned to breathe with it.